So Trump's hinted tariff relief is indeed good news for many, but it's also important to read behind Trump's tariff formula. For that, we turn to Professor Greg Buchak this morning. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So Trump is now considering pausing his auto tariffs. Now, where is this flexibility coming from?
Sure. So, I mean, at the outset, I just want to say I'm going to do my best to answer these questions as if there's a master plan behind this. As you know, there's a lot of flux. It's not super clear to me that there really is a master plan, but I'll do my best to offer a justification for the current state of play.
Please
so,
do.
Auto tariffs. One of Trump's stated goals is to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. By the way, the U.S. is already a major manufacturer. They're a sort of second largest manufacturer globally. The U.S. makes about 18% of global manufacturing by value. China's about 25 to 30%. And the U.S. tends to manufacture sort of specialized high value add things like airplanes, electronics, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment. And Trump wants more auto manufacturing in the U.S. Again, we already do a lot of that. We have Tesla, Kia, and Hyundai, for example, have large auto plants in the southern U.S. Trump wants more. And the thinking is that by raising tariffs on auto imports, that will make U.S. auto manufacturing more competitive domestically. So the transition is really difficult. You can't just snap your fingers and magically have a car factory materialize. You need to build the factories, you need to build out the supply chains. And I think the thinking here is like, let's give Ford or GM and so on some time to make that adjustment and bring supply chains domestically.
Right, it could be a months-long or years-long project for the U.S. to, produce cars solely. Now, the good news is that Trump says it'll prioritize its allies, including us, South Korea, when it comes to tariff negotiations. Now, will that be any helpful in any way for us, South Korea, or not as much? What do you think?
Sure. So, one of the other big tariff justification out there besides bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. is sort of a national security justification. And basically that is the U.S., but also pretty much everybody is currently very dependent on China for certain critical parts of the supply chain. So, for example, rare earth elements that are critical in electronics and batteries. And kind of the worry is that this dependence on China for critical materials kind of ties everybody's hands in how they can respond if China makes aggressive claims on the South China Sea, if China invades Taiwan, if they try to extract various concessions from neighbors like South Korea or Japan. So, the idea is by reducing reliance on China, that will allow for a stronger response. By the way, I think this is, sort of the best justification for tariffs. There's not a great economic argument for them, but there is some reasonable trade-off where we just decide to make ourselves a bit economically poorer in exchange for greater security. Are tariffs the best way to do that? I personally don't think so. I would prefer another way, but at least it's something. So the purpose here is to build global resilience against China as a sole provider of certain items. It makes sense to build this coalition of allies where inside the alliance there are low or minimal tariffs. By the way, this was kind of the idea behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was an agreement negotiated by the Obama administration and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton back in 2016. That was ready to go, but Trump killed it. Now maybe we're back to some version of that, and maybe better late than never. So is it good for South Korea? On one hand, other things equal, lower tariffs with the United States is good for Korea. On the other hand, this is likely going to be offered in exchange for something else. So crackdowns on Chinese transshipments, weapon systems based in Korea, for example. Whether the deal that Trump offers ends up being worth it for Korea, I'm not exactly sure, and I think we'll have to see how negotiations go.
Right, both sides have to play smart here. Now, Trump also signaled a flexibility on iPhones and not just cars. The question is, where is this generosity coming from? Is it to help Apple just only?
Yeah, this one's a little harder for me to justify. I think this sort of high-end electronics manufacturing like this is exactly what they wanted to bring back to the US, and exempting this seems counter to that goal. My best guess here is, Tim Cook went to President Trump and said it'll cost $3,000 to make an iPhone in California. And voters are going to hate that, so you better exempt them. And Trump really responded to that. I think kind of a lot of what we see in this tariff saga has kind of had the flavor of Trump will do a blanket tariff, and then individual companies will come to him in exchange for exemptions, and presumably in exchange for some favors to Trump.
Right, he is going to have to look after the consumers in the U.S. Now, China is also looking to survive through Trump's reckless tariff pressure. Now, isn't President Xi on his trip to Vietnam? He is in Southeast Asia. What is he trying to do there?
So I think two things are going on there. One, as I mentioned, to some extent, both Trump and Xi are sort of in doing some coalition building. Trump is trying to build his allies, Xi is trying to build his allies, and say to them, no, don't make a deal with Trump, join our camp here. The second thing is a big issue with tariffs that came up earlier in the report is they're sort of easy to get around through what are called transshipments, which just means, you build the thing in China, you ship it to Vietnam, maybe you put new packaging on it, but you don't really do any value add to the item, and then you ship it to the US. And if you do that, if there's sort of high tariffs coming out of China, but low tariffs coming out of Vietnam, that's a way to sort of bypass the tariffs, and that activity is pretty hard to monitor, for the US to monitor without some Vietnamese cooperation. And so the US kind of wants Vietnam to crack down on that, China clearly doesn't. Now, like, what is in Vietnam's interest here? It's kind of an interesting question. So on one hand, they're certainly enriched by engaging in this transshipment business. They can collect some fees on goods that pass through the country. On the other hand, Vietnam also wants their own domestic manufacturing sector to grow and be healthy. And that will be more competitive if they clamp down on these transshipments from China and sell their own domestically manufactured goods to the US. So what I think is going on here is both sides, the US and China, are sort of trying to convince Vietnam who's going to be the better partner. Do they want this sort of transshipments through China, or do they want to work on their own domestic manufacturing sectors?
Right. Well, last but not least, the U.S. has also begun national security probes into chips and pharmaceutical imports now. How much information and what kind of data does the government collect for the president to adjust imports to the U.S. and make a final call there?
Sure. So I think narrowly answering the national security question is kind of easy. So why is this important? A lot of Trump's authority to impose tariffs without the consent of Congress and the Senate, which would normally have to okay this stuff, comes through a section of our trade law in a subsection called Section 232. And it basically allows the president the authority to impose tariffs on things for national security reasons. So at a basic level, doing this legally and in a way that will withstand congressional or court challenges requires some kind of national security justification, and they're after that. Whatever you think about tariffs, I think it's a pretty easy argument to make that semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are of national security interest. Semiconductors are key components of modern weapon systems. They're important in sort of the nationwide infrastructure. And then on the other hand, if you run out of antibiotics or antivirals in the middle of a war or pandemic, clearly that has national security implications. I think like the needle they need to thread here is how do you tariff semiconductors that go into cruise missiles, which makes a lot of sense, while exempting the semiconductors that go into iPhones, so iPhones don't cost $3,000. And sort of threading that needle is what I think they're going to be thinking about over the next 270 days or perhaps a little shorter.
All right, Professor Buchak, thank you so much for connecting with us this morning. You enjoy your evening there.
Thanks for having me. Take care.